Ladies and gentlemen, students and teachers of the university, we begin this session with Dr. Kalyan Kumar Chakrabarty as the chief speaker. It is very difficult to introduce Chakrabarty. He is an icon among the Indian intellectuals. Wherever he has gone to the top. He became IAS and ended up as the secretary to the government of India. He was the member secretary of the IGNCA, Indira Gandhi National Center for the Arts. He was the chancellor of NOEPA. Like this, if I go on narrating, there will be no end to it. Therefore, I don't want to stand between him and you. I request him to deliver his lecture.
I won't go into the ceremonial formalities of address. I shall plunge straight into the subject. I have known Dr. Pattanayak and the Pattanayaks for the last several decades. And I have known Dr. Pattanayak as a person who combines passion and intelligence via affirmativa and via contemplativa. So he doesn't prefer to sit in the conning tower, the panoptic tower, but always leaps into the fray. And at 85, he is a cheerful, chirpy young man. And therefore I relate to him very well. And he falls down, gets up again, and gets going. And same with the family. I have been meeting the family also for a long time. And I came here with a specific objective, not to deliver a lecture, but to understand the mission and to read it forwards into the future, to be of catalytic help. So, when I was moving, yesterday I took a walk in the campus. There was a bus, but I found somebody commenting that it would have been better if we had walked. And while walking, I discovered all kinds of lanes, by-lanes, alleys, secret corners, two huge boulders. In fact, in my work as a rock art scientist, I come across such boulders all the time and come across the hills all the time. Yes, in universities, seated, perched in the midst of bluff and spur, hills and dales, with the horizon, not a horizon which is a fast vanishing horizon of felicity, always difficult to attain, but a clear horizon which is within reach. So, when I got this invitation to speak here 2-3 days earlier at DIFU. I was in the midst of an anthropological workshop of the INSA. So I gave this theme, indigeneity for survival. So, right now, when the question is addressed, who is indigenous, because the question was being raised, it's a very tricky question apparently, but it is easy to solve. And I recall also in the yesterday's walk that we found a lot of mechanistic skill development programs. And I also went to the village hut, which was being manned by students, some arts and crafts, and also organic farming. So I was recalling that ultimately what we are seeing is what is called in Greek, techne and episteme. Now, techne is a symbol of a technological civilization. Episteme has to be an epistemology, and metis, also a Greek word, is practical wisdom. Now, looking at the Pattanayaks and their tribe, one would naturally look for an alignment of ethos and pathos, of techne and episteme. If they sit together, they may be sitting together cheek by jowl. Question is there union? And if techne and episteme have come together, then our job is cut out and made. Well, now here is this university. There is a very large hinterland. Pratibha Roy is a Oriya author. She has, I think, written about Adi Bhumi, the primal land. Now, is the primal land to be discovered, worked with, or mastered? So, do we communicate with it only through skill development, or also through a co-directed, participative program of evoking the best and finest in their land and in their culture, and reinventing the cognitive categories of the social and natural sciences? Talking about social and natural sciences, this is supposed to be an interdisciplinary group. I have also arranged, since I have worn many hats, arranged Sarod and Sitar together. I have arranged all kinds of programs. Somebody plays this, somebody plays that. The fusion is very difficult. The synergy is difficult to attain. And in order for that to happen, in order to have a Leonardo da Vinci or a myriad-minded persons in the earlier part of the century, even Pattanayak is that, one has to do more. Now, here is this problem. Who is indigenous? Who is tribal? Obviously, tribal is an invented category. Indigenous is an invented category. Included, excluded. Notified, denotified. Tribal, non-tribal. Scheduled, non-scheduled. These are all colonial categories brought in the last 2 centuries. The semantics of the indigenous is also riddled with other problems, because the ILO definition, 1989, talks about peoples and populations. Peoples are those who have mastered the art. Populations are those like the pre-invasion Colombians, Aztecs, Mayas, who have been conquered and mastered. So, basically, the definition of the indigenous is an appropriative, objectifying, exploitative term. Truly speaking, one has to give a little bit of background in this. So, what is the colonial perception? Even a perceptive man like Johnson in Boswell. And Boswell shows Captain Cook's volume on the voyage to the South Sea to Johnson. Johnson says, "Don't cant in the defense of savages." Boswell says, "They have the art of navigation." Johnson, "A dog or a cat can swim." Boswell, "They carve very ingeniously." Johnson, "A cat can scratch, and a child with a nail can scratch." So, if that was the colonial approach, how to domesticate them into the master narrative, the meta text. The UNESCO definition, which was recent in early 90s, Encyclopedia of Life Support Systems, talking about sustainability. It says, the Aboriginals, the indigenous, they were as unfamiliar with the concept of sustainability as Aristotle was unfamiliar with the expression of value. They were associated historically with inactive approaches, and they had no concept of a sustainable society. So obviously, they need to be taught, we and they. And then we come to the philosophical background. Hegel, in his 3 tracts, talks about India or Asia as a society in a state of dreaming, like a woman after childbirth, vapid, beautiful, but not active. And this society has to be inseminated, harvested, and fructified. It cannot do it on its own. There has to be an outside agency. And so Marx, talking about peasant proprietors, says they can't represent themselves. They have to be represented. The 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon. Then, coming to Vedantic philosophy, Paul Hacker, great Vedantin, says, he quotes the philosophy of usus justus, utilization, in church philosophy, and says that the native logos seed, now he is tribalizing the Orient. We talk about tribalization. We today, in post-colonial India, tribalize the rural from the urban. We tribalize the hills from the plains. So tribal is even today an invented category. So he was saying that the native logos seed cannot grow and bear flower and fruit in its own indigenous soil. It can bear flower and fruit and blossom only when it is transplanted to the soil, fertilized by the Judeo-Christian stream of thought. Now this is not just words. This is how our administrators today, including people like us, this is exactly what we are doing. Digital India, Startup India, corporatization of India, there are all kinds of efforts by the government. But I recall that when Sam Pitroda tried his technology missions, the only missions which succeeded were those connected with technology per se. whether it is rural telephony or technology of, but the technology on governance did not succeed. It has not succeeded, and it may never succeed. His mission on governance was a total failure. Why? Because of these semantic problems which befog the thinking of our administrators and planners. So, we are talking about Centurion University, but we are also talking about the indigenous. We are talking about the multiversity, which the university can be. The biocultural diversity that is there in the hinterland. The biocultural cartography, which Dr. Pattanayak took up when I was at the IGNCA. The mental map, the linguistic map, the biocultural map, they were to be coterminous. These artificial boundaries of the state, districts, politically and administratively given, are not the boundaries of the indigenous. To be indigenous, one has to really engage in some exertion. So there, today the development fails. I have administered development in the hard way, administering 300,000 people at a time, and I have always seen that the discontent, the failure, come out of the fact that there are artificial boundaries for development. The linguistic provinces, language is not only language that is spoken, that is scripted, or that is even unscripted, that is oral. It is the language of development. It is the language which is coincident with the boundaries which are given by ecology and culture and biology. Those boundaries overlap. They overlap also international borders. And I wish there was a day when there could be an international community effort to understand this and transcend these boundaries which are given artificially by human beings and not by nature. So, when I was looking at the university, coming back to the university again, I shall just talk about the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C., designed by Maya Lin, in which across an undulating site, all kinds of deposits were made. Rubbings, poker hand, full house, SS high, no claims, no mementos. Finally, they were housed in a museum. So that was a kind of being indigenous, truthful to the spirit of sacrifice, immolation, etc. And then there was this Iwo Jima statue, memorial of war in the Pacific. When the flag was raised on the Mount Suribachi in Japan, on Iwo Jima, then this statue of victory was made. A big, sturdy man riding a horse. And you look at it with awe as a distant icon, not with familiarity or with affection. Two ideas, not that the two cannot converge, not that the power and the grace cannot converge. They can, and they have in individuals and institutions. So, here we are dealing with the indigenous, trying to animate a space. Should it be subject to state and para-state, compradorial, corporatist interventions or ideas? Or should it go beyond to embrace the indigenous? Um, in this connection, one recalls the Vanuatu Islanders who attained independence in 1980 from Australia. They attained independence on the premise of a custom, KASTOM, which would embrace the land, the sea, the air, the resources above the ground, the resources below the ground, and it was a comprehensive concept of heritage, tangible and intangible. And they won independence on the basis of that. Australia, of course, there are vast open spaces, and there are these land claims, and there are these councils which negotiate the land claims. And in spite of the fact that millions of Australians were, the Aborigines were slaughtered initially, there is now a coming back to the restitution and an attempt to recompense and put people in custodian responsibility, like at Ayers Rock, etc. And there are conflicts, there are legal tangles. There was this Mulpurru case in the, I think, Queensland Supreme Court, in which the court decided that to take Aboriginal designs into the T-shirt is not quite on. In this new regime of IPR, even these communities are being domesticated into the individual titulary regime of the global IPR, forgetting that the indigenous IPR is always a community IPR, a collective IPR, which is shared and which doesn't exclude, which includes. Whether it's digital inclusion or any other inclusion, it cannot be within the campus or even, or a fiber optic, bone stretched across the land. It has to understand the quintessential, indigenous knowledge systems, ways they relate to the land, not neglect it. Understand that there is a need to recover the meaning and the technique, both the metis and the episteme. And I have administered forests as Additional Chief Secretary Forests, and I have seen that even a tribal child used to know more than me about the taxonomy. You bring in a botanist, now of course that knowledge is fast vanishing, because we tell them that the knowledge doesn't matter. Because the knowledge has to be recorded. It has to be textualized. Knowledge is not knowledge until it is textualized. It is codified. If it is contextual, it is not knowledge. You do not see that knowledge on scientific principles is either knowledge which is testable, falsifiable, replicable, or it is not. If you apply that test, much of the knowledge which is scientifically produced is proved to be unscientific very soon. So all knowledge is not Western. Nor is all Western knowledge scientific. Road to modernization is not the road through technification and homogenization alone. The road to modernization, there could be 100 roads to modernization. So obviously the task of the university, which has taken such a mission, is to explore those roads. So as we talk about the indigenous and the civilizational crisis, is there a crisis? What can the indigenous do about it, if there is one? Who are the indigenous? What do they? They are just a small little group of people who should be pushed to the wall, consigned to the dung heap of history. and not bothered about. They should be displayed in a museum like Manav Sangrahalaya, which I headed for some time. They should be put in a zoo. They should certainly not be, come in and bother us. And the trouble is that when I was at the museum, I saw that it was a museum of huts. It was not a museum of communities. So what to do? Move from ex situ display to in situ revitalization. Instead of having communities visit the museum, have the museum visit the communities. Instead of doing mere documentation and survey, which is to be salvage, do co-directed regenerative programs. 3-4 words, very little money was spent. I cannot give illustrations. There are hundreds of illustrations how we did it. Because you would go out, talk to the community, invite them into partnership. Very soon they would understand. And what would happen is they would spend 80% to 90% of the money. They would not spend money, they would invite, let us say, 90 villages, and they would assemble at a height of 10,000 feet. And they would engage in experiments like transhumans, or, even among Nagarathas, Mats, etc., the 9 Swamis, all kinds. I don't want to go into those details because that would be boring and to some extent self-serving. Basically, the idea was how to demuseumize, how to use the museum as an instrument of demuseumization, how to use the university as an instrument of multiversity. So now, in the same way, at the IGNCA, charters are made, but charters are not made to be followed. They're just jumbled together from a few documents, and they're fished around and thrown around for seeking funding or, boasting about what has been done. It talks about relations among disciplines, relations among categories of knowledge, relations among arts, relations between arts and life. But when it came to the brass tacks, it was only seminars. You invite 50 scholars, 200 scholars from all over the world, spend a few millions of dollars, and say that you have done your job. Now, relations are not built like that. For building relations, one has to walk the talk, go into the ground, work shoulder to shoulder with communities, evoke the essence of their culture and their science, not ignore it, not neglect it, and then create that fusion using the technology. Technology is just a tool. Technology cannot become the be-all and end-all of anything. And then the university becomes the center of a multiple foci of action all over the country, where it can provide the role of a guide and a mentor and a catalytic agent for inciting change. So we come back to the theme again. Is there a civilization crisis? Don't you know what is going on? Don't you know that there have been 5 extinctions already and the 6th extinction is coming? And the human being, if he thinks or she thinks that we are at the pinnacle of creation and we shall rule the roost forever, well, they must think better. It may not come in our time, but if the signs are clear, we may be overcome by extinction very early in the day. Because what are the signs? The climate change, of course, is there. It is ignored. Normally, we go to international gatherings to quibble about who has the greater right to pollute, not how to share the burden of stopping the pollution. There are collapsing fisheries, sinking aquifers, shrinking forests, rising violence, increasing unemployment, growing strife, and the current rate of extinction is 40,000 times more than the background rate of extinction. Even in cultural heritage, every day, now I deal with rock art, prehistoric rock art. There must be a million sites in the country, but the archaeological survey can only study what is amenable to study, monuments and archaeological sites. And even those are studied in terms of Abbeville-Acheulean, Perigordian, all borrowed from the Franco-Cantabrian belt, like in all our sciences. All categories are borrowed. They are not locally adopted. They are not reframed, rephrased. So, there is a need to reinvent our cognitive categories. How to do it? Now look at forestry. We are in a land full of forest and denizens of the forest. But we are following the principle given by Mr. Brandis, a German forester, of scientific forestry. Scientific forestry is of moving from non-fiscal forestry to fiscal forestry, of moving from non-timber forestry to timber forestry, of abjuring the microfauna and embrace the megafauna. And when I look at tribal people living inside the forest sometimes, I mean, some of them live, some of them are adjacent, and some of them have been distanced. All of us are indigenous, but we have been retribalized. We have lost that continent of ideas which we shared at some point of time, from which have been vanished. And Matthew Arnold used to say that we are surrounded by a veil of tears which we would like to cross, but we are unable to cross because there are insuperable barriers rising in front of us. So those are barriers of understanding. So in this case also, forestry has to be reinvented. It cannot be the silvicultural approach of the foresters. It has to be co-created with the communities. Mulnan Madhuta programs were undertaken in 1930s in Bastar, which are extremely successful in regeneration of forest. But today there is a conflict always between forest and environment and other departments. Agriculture. I was in Chhattisgarh. Now there was this Mr. Richaria of the Agriculture University who had collected the germplasm of 20,000 varieties of paddy. Now that germplasm is there, museumized. But today, Chhattisgarh is reduced to using about 20-30 high input intensive varieties of paddy, which require a lot of inputs of fertilizer and herbicide, herbicide, this and that, and lot of water. They are dwarf varieties, short duration varieties. They are slow growing varieties, I mean, which are there, which are healthful, which are nutritious, which are known to the women in the family who grew, who had knowledge of not only epistemology, but also bacteriology and chemistry. And yes, we know that the Latin taxonomy they didn't have, but they had their own taxonomy. They still have, by the way. So from monocrop, how to go back to polycrop, to intercropping, to recovering that variety, not the variety, that's a wrong choice of word, the diversity, because it is the replacement of diversity by variety. The replacement of diversity is, this synergistic, co-evolutionary interdependence of organic and inorganic communities in nature. Variety comes out of plantation, not out of transgenerational growth. So then cities, we make out cities. They are monocephalic cities. Cities of man, cities of plan, not of man. The alleys, the byways, you will say that those are very inefficient. They don't permit cardiovascular respiration, as if Delhi does, as if Chandigarh does. So, there is some problem here in understanding how the city should be made. Marshall McMillan or not, we should look at our own cities, how they are made, the water bodies, the natural resources, the gardens, the spaces, how they are made. That was also indigenous. Indigenous is not just the tribal now that is another problem. The racial and biocultural, confusion. Gustave Le Bon, then Gobineau, who talked about, the biological characteristic and the cultural inferiority being coterminous. How wrong they were. Look at the Australian National Museum in Sydney or other museums, how the categorization is done, how it was done initially on anthropological basis of looking at the other. But there are others. But there are other others who are more other than other others. So we have to concern ourselves with those others and bring them into the fold. Even in there, then these mega dams. Now, is a mega dam successful in a mountain which is highly unstable, tectonically unstable, which is full of young mountain? I mean, is it stable? I mean, in a place which is close to the city, which is also tectonically unstable? Shouldn't one look at the Guls and the Kuls and the Naulas and the Jalsundhas, Gajadhars, the resource custodians all over the country, and look at the water harvesting structures which used to catch 60% of the runoff in earlier days. Even today, 1,000-year-old dam made by the Chola king is there, intact. But today we don't give more than 50 years or 100 years for a dam. And before that it develops a fissure and a crack. Now this is no romanticism, mind you. The evidence is there. It is indigenous, but we prefer not to look at it. Because we are enslaved and mentally, and we do not know how to look out of the window. The iPad itself. Now, here we are talking about documentation. Yes, in order to adjust to the international regime, you have to develop a prior art database, as it is called, for defensive disclosure. But apart from the database, one has to be careful that the microspatial knowledge and the cosmopolitan knowledge, there is an equal partnership. That the cosmopolitan knowledge, the deductive or inductive, this mutual absorption, one must see that there is an equal partnership. And that one doesn't turn it into a doppelganger, an evil imitation, borrowing and stealing the look and feel, color and texture of the pristine original version and corrupting it in the change. So we are talking basically about creating counter narratives against the master narrative. If you are talking about narrativizing the indigenous, you are talking about counter narratives. I can give you 100 examples of such counter narrative, but I don't think there is time. I shall just give brief allusions, like the Kotlikue Theatre in New York, where the Mexican and the Spanish approaches are combined for creating an unique band. And then there are, for instance, a proposed Bush University in Arnhem Land, where cultural hybridism, rock, reggae, country western, techno dance are combined with invitation to the spirits, with a didgeridoo. Or code switching, Nagamis and other languages here. Then Cree and English combining in Manitoba, Canada. English European sonata to play Loon Cry wolves at nightfall, wind through the pine, flight of white Arctic terns. I can go on multiplying, but I shall not, because that would be, again, getting tempted. There are hundreds of such examples all over the world, if one chooses to dig them out. Hundreds of examples all over this country, in the hinterland, which one can see and see that the fusion is there, synergy is there, that the people are trying to survive even this Holocaust that is on us. And these counter narratives are necessary to create. I mean, I cannot but resist the temptation of one quotation from this Caribbean author, Derek Walcott, how he stands the language on its head and creates his own. How he uses English to subvert English. How he colonizes English with his own terminologies. Again, I won't go into the quotation. So, all I am saying is that it is time that we looked at this fact that there is an ongoing enclosure of the commons. There is an ongoing enclosure of the knowledge commons. How to rescue the land from this enclosure, in vivo, in vitro, in silico. Then life science, industry sciences being turned into sciences on the assembly line for commerce. The Nagaland learner who calls himself Tajungar, and non-learner who calls himself Majungar. The non-learner retains the customs and the knowledge. The learner loses them. So, we are looking for a society in which arts and life are convergent, in which artist is no special kind of a man, but every man is a special kind of an artist, in which everything connects. Hidden worlds connect to the things that hide them. Within the bark of redwood lies moss, under which are toads and insects. Tide pools connect with unfathomable seas, which connect with our chromosomes. Roger Rosenblatt in Time. Or Leibniz, each portion of matter, monadology, is conceivable as a garden full of plants, ponds full of fishes, but each branch of plant, each member of animals, each drop of humus is also such a garden or such a pond. If we look for this garden and pond, we shall find them here. And I am quite sure that the task of the university, turning itself to a multiversity, will have been made. Thank you.
Mr. Chakravarti has covered a lot of space as well as time. I am sure there will be many questions. It may not be possible to answer all the questions, but he will answer some questions. So let us have few questions.
I really liked your defining the indigenous. Could you now just go on and move to what you think is indigeneity from that? You know, like what does indigeneity mean? Because for the last 3 days we've been deliberating on that, but I would appreciate your view on that.
Indigeneity is basically for a human being to be human. Human being is not yet human. He still remains to be humanized. And because he is not human, we have all the problems. So how to be human? Only if nature and culture are in balance. Because human being doesn't think that he is an agent of nature or he is part of nature. He doesn't think he is part of the web. He thinks he is the weaver. And that is the biggest problem. And so he is destroying right and left the balance between nature and culture. And somebody says that, the Noah's Ark was the first museum when the best and finest were put in the boat for being transported out of the debacle, the disaster. And may this university look at it that way. So to be indigenous is to be part of that, as I said, the web which connects all organic and inorganic, human and non-human communities. If somebody is connected that way, he doesn't have to be there in the schedule of the constitution. He may be a Brahmin, he may be a Shudra, maybe whatever he is, but he is human. But if he has lost that sense of urgency and connection, then he is not human, and therefore he is not indigenous, therefore he is not tribal. The tribal word is an invented word. I see it that way.
You have put all the divergent views across the world to explain what indigenous or indigeneity could be. Coming back to Indian context, you're talking about detribalization. Don't you think it goes hand in hand with constitutional provisions of India in the interest of the tribals? Number one. You mentioned about forest. You mentioned about entry of Brandis, 1884 kind of thing. And then from there onward, it was done, whatever was done in the interest of forest was merely to raise revenue to the government. This was one approach. However, over the years of the policies 1927, 52, or 1988, don't you see some digression and favorable action in the interest of the tribals to re-tribalize those people by extending so many facilities and claims to that?
I do not, because the entire history is a history of forest legislation, is a history of movement from rights through privileges to concessions. And at the beginning of the 20th century, the forest cover was about 50%. Today, through the remote sensing eye, the forest cover is only about 17 to 18%. And recently, the Western Ghats, which is supposed to be a Vavilov center, a biodiversity zone, I think the government has decided to excise 6,000 square kilometers of forest. And I was part of a signatory of Badhav Gadgil's report, which proposed its protection. Because you want to use forest as a global sink, a carbon sink. You want to use forest as a mine, as a range, as a dome, as a catchment. That is not what the forest is meant for. And forest doesn't have to exclude. In fact, if the Wildlife Act, which gives protection to the tiger, also defined the tribal as the tribal would get more protection as an inhabitant of the forest. Now the tribal and the forest were not two separable common quantities. The day was, and I have dealt with revenue villages, no, not at all. The government policies, irrespective of parties, has been the same to capture the forest, to put it on the assembly line. And if the only good initiative is of joint forest management, community forest management, but there it has only limited coverage in the country. It doesn't cover all the forests in the country.
How do you look at the Forest Rights Act of 2006?
The Forest Rights Act of 2006, again, you see, is limited in scope because even the Supreme Court and the High Court were limited by their interpretation of the Forest Conservation Act. The fact that forests cannot be... The Rights Act, the tribal rights. The tribal rights were also there. Tribal rights were there. Tribal rights were there, limited to collection of certain produces and certain varieties of forest. So it was just widened. I mean, it doesn't let them live with the forest.
This is less of a question, but more of what I would like to share, sir, with you, especially as you were talking about mega dams. And in the context of Jharkhand, if I look at the counter narrative of fusion and synergy, as you said, there is this gentleman called Simon Oraon, and he has single-handedly, with community support, constructed 6 mud dams which has irrigated more than 5,000 acres.
Yeah.
It is only now that the government of Jharkhand has kind of woken up and given him some support. But I thought that it was important that I tell it.
Certainly. In fact, Tarun Bharat Sangh with the Johars in Rajasthan also have done a similar thing, revitalizing the local harvesting structures. But there we have thousands of forts. All over Western Ghats also there are these water management structures. Even the Western Ghats, these caves which have 2nd century AD sculptures and paintings, etc. Even there are water harvesting channels and runnels. What I am trying to say, there are existing water harvesting structures all over Himachal Pradesh. There are nolas. Now, even if they are kept in life, nothing more, a little bit of maintenance. So you see, the money invested would be so minimal. And in fact, as soon as it is made into a mega project, infrastructural project, you give it to that kind of an agency. I don't want to name anybody because I'd be quoted out of turn. But then immediately the cost would escalate. Whereas it requires very little, maintenance and repair, and they have survived for 1,000 years. They can survive for 1,000 years more.
I would like to hear some Indian or local counter narratives that you said there are plenty, but more in the example that you gave of the New York example.
No, yeah. There are a lot of local narratives. In fact, for instance, if you want, because I thought that I shall avoid because in fact what I was talking about was getting such counter narratives from within the hinterland here, not trying to give those narratives here, because there are too many and I shall always miss something if I try to talk about them. But for instance, the Silent Valley, Kerala, there was this when they were engaged in this Kerala Shastra Parishad, they were inventing these counter narratives. When it was the Chipko Andolan and this lady Gaura Devi, and she invented her counter narrative. It is not just a written story; it is also the narrative of gestures and postures. And in fact, Bahugunaji would say that I am just a runner and a messenger. These are the real soldiers. And then there is this Mahashata Devi's narratives of torture and oppression, which are real, based on real stories in life, on the basis of which I have been chairman of the Bhasha Trust in Baroda. So an entire, drama movement is there. Budhan, what happens, when you face persecution. So that is another narrative. Then this Choti Munda, this Birsa Munda's Ulgulan, he had also invented a counter narrative. And what would happen with his arrow. Of course, there have been subsequent interpretations. The counter narrative invented by his gestures have been further interpreted, but they have left an imprint. Then Mabeli Mantam in the resurrection, also in Kerala, how they are trying to bring back the Mantam against the oppression of, moneylenders and oppressors. Then there was Bodo, Narjinari writes about it, the Bodo woman who asserts the gender rights, that a bard or so I am not, I may be detained at home or in a cage. And there are hundreds of gender narratives, which are there all over the country. And I have to, if I, Cholanaiken, Kerala, who are comparing, you see, the stages of pregnancy of a tribal girl with the stages in the development of banana leaves. Or the Sangam, you see, narrative of fivefold, you see, multifurcation of the biosphere. And the earlier narrative in Sangam literature of love and war, Kurinchi and Betchi, of how the biosphere also would be divided like that. Then, even in classical literature, whether you look at the airplane or the cathedral, the hymn or the mathematical equation, the Shanta or the Ugra, the immanent and the transcendent, they are always equated in terms of their efficiency in realizing the objective. The question is not whether somebody is ugly or beautiful. It's beautiful if it is made according to its purpose, if it is Sukrita. So, there will be hundreds of examples, and that is what I am saying, that they can be retrieved from here. Those counter narratives have not been retrieved from our land because nobody cares for them.
Thank you very much, sir. It's a very basic question, actually. In the vision that you propose, it seems to me that the meta-narrative of economic growth, the market and the capitalism takes a big hit. So what's the sales pitch? How do you persuade people to become less impatient and aspirational, because the whole of India is on that trip now? That's how it looks, yeah? So how do you try to work on that? Yeah.
You see, the definition of the people. If people could think as a homogeneous entity after election or otherwise, all right. But because the democracies today are monumental affairs in which the government deserts you as soon as it is elected, and the people do not have any choice because they have moved from pillar to post, running around from pillar to post, and so the technocracy takes over, and also the bureaucracy. Like people like us, and mostly it is the interest which is shared. That is an interest which is superior to that of the nation or any or the world. So ultimately, the capitalist, bureaucratic, technocratic nexus is so strong that if it has to be exploited, understanding has to be created. And unless a university is there to resolve problems of understanding, how can you deal with this kind of problem? Because the misunderstanding is total. Some of my close friends who are very compassionate otherwise, they plead the same philosophy. No, China has been doing such mega dams, and but mega dams are also being dismantled in other parts of the world. So the knowledge is limited, the education is limited, so people go on fighting, and then if you fight with them, it is almost like bloodshed. So what's the point?
Thank you. This has been a wonderful lecture. I am sure everybody has been very happy and very satisfied. We have reached a point of thorough confusion. Because whether you talk about bureaucratic, you talk about technocratic, you talk about anything, they are so confusing and so controversial that this is a continuing debate. See, even the simplest thing is that we are in a democracy. We have a constitution. Who owns the constitution? Is it a democracy by the people of India, or it is a democracy by the people's representatives? It's a very critical question. But we begin by saying, we the people of India. But now a question has arisen, whether is it true that it is we the people of India, or we the representatives of the people of India? So there are every little point can be subject to discussion. And I think the more discussions take place, the better off we are. And we have very few people like Kalyan Chakravarti who can really take this thing to a level and to a height where it is not very easy to reach. Therefore, we are thankful, grateful to Dr. Chakravarti for being with us this morning and giving us a wonderful lecture. Let's give him a hand.